Don Bentley and I sat down to discuss his time flying an Apache helicopter in Afghanistan, his time grooming sources for the FBI, writing both the Jack Ryan Jr. novels and Matt Drake novels, including his upcoming novel Forgotten War. He recounted his harrowing part flying a rescue mission in Operation Red Wings, popularized by the novel and movie Lone Survivor, written by retired Navy SEAL Marcus Luttrell. We also discussed how impactful the withdrawal from Afghanistan has been on veterans, how biometric and personal information is no longer safe in government hands, and much more. And now, here is Don Bentley. Hello and welcome to the RSnake Show. Today I have with me Don Bentley. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Robert.
Yeah, it's good to see you down here. And you live in the Austin area?
I do. I live just north of Austin, so up in Round Rock, yeah.
So that wasn't too bad.
I mean, it was a good hour. That's how much I love you right now, is I'm willing to come into Austin for you. So.
Yeah. I've definitely done the drive a couple times where it looks like a 15 minutes. It's a quick little drive.
Yeah.
Nope, not.
You know what's hysterical, not to get all talking about traffic, but the express lane, what I love is when I'm in the normal lane and it's just sitting there and I just wave to them as I go by. I'm like, suckers!
Yeah. Sometimes I can't get on in time. I'm like,
It's choices.
Or I think, oh, it's going pretty good. I don't need to do that today. Nope.
Famous last words.
All right. Well, we're here to talk about a couple of things. You have a pretty crazy career.
I do.
All kinds of crazy stuff happened. So I don't know if going chronologically makes this right sense or not.
Sure.
It's just kind of, I guess, the easiest way to understand it.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll just start with kind of the beginning. So why don't you tell us a little bit about getting into the military, kind of like what was your impetus for doing that and kind of how that all started?
Yeah, so my wife likes to tell people that I can't figure out what I want to be when I grow up, and so there's probably a lot of truth to that. But I grew up in a family. My dad had served in Vietnam. My grandfather had served in World War II, and I like to say I'm the first member of my family who voluntarily served, but I knew from a pretty young age I wanted to serve in the military. My dad was a pilot, and so I grew up. He did it not commercially, but just in little planes, teaching people stuff like that. And so I grew up flying with him, and wanted to do that, and thought I could either go in the Air Force or the Army. Now the problem with the Air Force is that if you can't fly, there aren't a whole lot of other fun things to do. While in the Army, man, they let you blow stuff up and rappel off buildings, and so I had a Army ROTC scholarship to go to the Ohio State University, and then was commissioned in aviation, was lucky enough to fly Apaches afterwards.
Yeah. That's pretty badass.
It is, and it's funny because your very first day of flight school, they invite your spouse to come too, and so the instructor says, we're going to give your spouse a test, and based on the results of that test, it'll determine what helicopter you fly. And so everybody gets a little nervous about that. So my wife came in and they gave her the questions, and it was, if your husband or wife is a very meticulous, detail-oriented person, they're probably going to fly Blackhawks. And it gets all the way down to, if your husband or wife likes to light things on fire and watch them burn, they are probably going to be an Apache pilot. And she pointed at me, and I'm like, yeah, that's the one for me.
I already had a reputation before it even started.
Yes.
Interesting. So what is the actual selection process? Can you tell me?
Yeah, so it's little bit of both. It's a little bit of a OML or Order of Merit list, where as you're going through flight school, there's the flying part of it that you get graded on. There's the academics part, and then at the same time, there's the quintessential needs of the Army, which trumps everything else. And so I was very fortunate that I scored pretty well through flight school, and at the same time, the Army had a really big need for Apache pilots at that time. So I was lucky. Other folks, the Army always gives you the opportunity to ask what you want, but the Army doesn't always listen to what you're saying. And so I was very, very lucky that those two things lined up together.
Did you ask? Did you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you were very clear.
I was very clear. Yeah.
Okay.
So you fill out that there comes the day towards the end of flight school where you fill out your own Order of Merit list and you rank, which helicopter that you got to fly. And I'm like, dear Lord, just please don't let me fly Blackhawks. That's all I'm asking you right now. Don't let me fly Blackhawks.
Would it have been that bad? I mean, at least you've been in the air.
I would have been the butt of the jokes instead of the one making them. So this is a true story. I had a friend of mine who was an Apache pilot who deployed to Afghanistan, and he was out with an infantry unit, and this tells you how much that created the aircraft stays with you. And he was sitting in, the Porta-John, and a mortar hit next door and knocked him out. And so they grabbed him and were throwing him into the ambulance, and he's like, "Get off me! I'm not a Black Hawk pilot." And that is how much it's ingrained to you what aircraft you fly.
And God help you if you're a Chinook, right?
The flying dump truck, yes. It's true, and there is a lot of good-natured ribbon, but once you go to combat with those folks and you see a Chinook hovering on the side of the mountain with just that ramp balance there so guys can run on it, or you watch a Black Hawk fly down a valley that's barely big enough than the rotors of that Black Hawk, and you're like, maybe I won't make any jokes today.
Right. Yeah. Or those like really super specialized Black Hawks that the SEALs have or whatever. And like those the
160th birds. Yeah. So we did in Afghanistan, we supported the 160th quite a bit because their DAPs, which is they have the normal Black Hawks and then the armed Black Hawks, and their armed Black Hawks were all in Iraq, and their little birds can't operate in that part of Afghanistan because it's too high and stuff. And so it's a little bit unusual. General purpose aviation doesn't often have those kind of customers, but we got to do it some in Afghanistan.
Yeah. What I understand about Afghanistan is it's so high up, a lot of the helicopters literally can't do it.
Yeah.
They could get to a certain altitude and then they're done.
That's absolutely right. So we were the first longbows into Afghanistan, and the reason why that's significant is the longbow was 3,000 or 4,000 pounds heavier than the Alpha model, but it had the same engines, and so it was way, way underpowered. So before we even went, we tore off all the radar, we tore off the Hellfire racks, we just used 30 millimeter and rockets while we were there, and we took out like all the different black boxes that we could, and we still didn't, in the summertime, we still didn't have enough power to hover. And it was funny, in flight school, when I went through, most of our instructors were all old Vietnam guys, and they would tell stories, and we'd be like, whatever, Grandpa. And the one, my instructor pilot liked to tell a lot. He said, in Vietnam, we were so underpowered, we had to choose between gas and bullets. And I'm like, sure you were. And then there I was in Afghanistan sitting in the FARP, and they had to do it by hand. And the longbow, it's a little computer screen that updates the weight and balance. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, I don't have enough. Do I want more gas or more bullets? And I'm like, one day I'm going to be that old guy. I'm like, let me buy you a beer and tell you stories. So, yeah, it was humbling in a lot of ways. We didn't lose any Apaches to enemy fire while we were in Afghanistan, but we lost two to guys overflying the environment because you didn't have power to hover out of ground effect at all. And in ground effect, what you would do is kind of bounce along the ground and try and get at about 18 to 20 knots. What happens is the forward airspeed cleans up the rotors, and so it gets more efficient. And so what you had to do was get to 18 knots before you hit the HESCO barrier on the other side. And so you're bouncing, and you're like, oh, I kind of got it, and then go over the other side. And so,
oh, that's harrowing.
Yeah, I tell people I didn't get shot at that many times, but I almost killed myself flying about every day in the summertime. Wow. So it was sketchy.
Why summertime specifically?
Yeah, so what happens is when it's hot and high, the engines are controlled by a computer. It's called the Digital Engine Control Unit. And so what happens is that little black box keeps the engine from overheating. And the way it keeps the engine from overheating is it regulates the amount of fuel that goes into it. So when you're hot already, because it's hot outside, and you're high, which means there's very little air to be able to cool the engine, they heat up that much faster. And so what happens, and I'm a good pilot, so I'm using my hands, you have a stick over here that's called the collective, and you pull it in, and you're asking the engine for more power, but that little box limits you and refuses to dump more fuel in. And so then what happens, if you're not careful, is your rotors unspool and you turn into a lawn dart. And so you have to be very, very careful. In fact, before you'd fly, you'd do this math where in an Apache, about 200 pounds is an extra 1% of torque or 1% of power. And so you do that calculations and say, how many hundreds of pounds am I carrying that I could blow off if I needed to have a little extra power to either cushion or take off. And so what you would do a lot of times, if I was flying in the back seat, I'd have my front seat have his hand on the jettison switch, and if it looked like we were going to get in trouble, I wanted him to blow the stores, and he would blow off the rocket pods, basically, so you'd have just a little bit more power to try and land or to try and make it over that wall or something. So fortunately, we didn't have to do that, but every day in the summertime, it was crazy.
Wow, I had no idea. So did they eventually put better engines on there?
Yeah. The Rumsfeld famously said that you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. And so you saw that in Iraq where, guys were in thin-skinned vehicles, were getting killed left and right by IEDs. And eventually the army caught up to that and fixed it and had MRAPs and things like that. In Afghanistan, it was much the same thing, where it was a better helicopter. The Longbow by far was a better helicopter. But Apaches in general were built or designed in the Cold War with that mission of, in the Fulda Gap in Germany is where the Soviet armored hordes were going to come pouring through, and we couldn't match them tank for tank. And so we had the A-10 and the Apache that would be able to just loft rockets in and kill them. And so what the first Apache units, the 101st guys that were as part of Operation Anaconda, they figured out in real time they didn't have the power to sit and hover and shoot rockets, because that's what you practiced all the time. You'd come to a hover, shoot the rockets, and it was actually, you could use both the front seat and the back seat and shoot them a long ways. Works really good if you can hover. If you can't hover, it's a completely different method. And so they literally had to give, some of the older warrant officers were given classes over the radio, say, look, you got to do diving fire. This is how you do it. And we're learning on the fly how to be able to do it. And so we went to Afghanistan in 2005. And so we had the benefit of seeing what they did. And so we structured all the simulator training to be like Afghanistan. When we flew, we loaded the helicopters down to try and be like how we would be there. And we practiced diving fire all the time, and in fact redid our gunnery tables so that we would do diving fire engagements. And so we came a lot better prepared than the first folks that went in, but there was still a learning curve, no doubt.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, the other thing I was kind of curious about is this. I feel like I watched some movie when I was a kid about eye dominance issues in the Apache.
Yeah.
I cannot for the life of me remember.
Oh, it's called Firebirds.
Is that what it's called?
It's got Nicolas Cage in it. So the Navy got Top Gun and Tom Cruise, and we got Nick Cage in Firebirds. That's what happened right there.
I do remember enjoying the movie. It's just been so long. I was a kid when I saw it. How much truth is there to that? So
unfortunately, a lot. That movie was actually shot at Fort Hood. It was shot before I was there. And when I showed up, Fort Hood was my second assignment out of flight school. I went to Korea first and then Fort Hood. And they called it the movie that shall not be named. You weren't actually allowed to say the name of the movie because it was so terrible. But what happens, one of the things that makes the Apache is designed to be a killing machine, and it's very, very good at its job. And so one of the ways that it's good at its job is you have, I'm going to use my hands again, you have what's called an HDU, a helmet display unit, that rests over your right eye like this. And so what happens is there are little infrared sensors on your helmet, and you climb into the helicopter, and they call it a bore sight, this little light, and you line up the HDU with that light, and you key it, and what you're doing is telling the fire control computer where your eye is in relation to the helmet. And so you can then use that to, the 30 millimeter gun underneath can follow your eye, you can shoot rockets, you can shoot a whole bunch of stuff with that. The other thing that you do that you're referencing is the Apache, at least originally, you didn't fly with night vision goggles. What you did is flew with the thermal. Now in Afghanistan, we'd gotten to the point where we used both, because on a low light night, a low illume night, the thermal's actually better, but for the most part, goggles are better, and the guys on the ground are using goggles, and so you want to be able to see in their spectrum. Mm-hmm. But in order to be able to fly with that, what you had to get used to is using your right eye to see outside and your left eye to see inside, and so you're actually flipping back and forth between eyes. And so the way they teach you to do it is called flying the bag, where they take these high-tech garbage bags and tape it all over the back window of the cockpit. And so the instructor...
Literal garbage bags?
Literal garbage bags. High-tech solutions. Black, hefty garbage bags. And so it's daytime so you don't kill yourself because the instructor pilot's sitting in the front seat and he can see. And so you're learning to try and fly just out of this eye. And so it's terrible as you're doing it first. And what's worse, the eye dominant problems come in. If you're left eye dominant, it takes a while to train yourself to use your right eye. And to make it worse, those high-tech garbage bags would have little pinholes in them where something had rubbed them. And so that usually manifests yourself as you're flying on approach and you're sweating like crazy because you're concentrating so hard and the black bags everywhere. And you're, doing this as you're coming in to land, and a little shaft of sunlight will come through that pinhole and your left eye will take over like this. And so you're like, oh my gosh, and you're trying to close that left eye so you can see with your right eye. But once you get that down, I actually needed extra time to do it. Sometimes my first bag check ride, I failed, and I had to get extra hours in order to do it because it's so contrary to anything you've ever done. But once you get good at it, that sensor that you're flying with, if this is the Apache, the sensor's on the nose of it like this. And so what you can actually do is look through the floor of the helicopter because you're putting your head down, the sensor's up here, and it's looking down so you can see that way. And so my first combat mission I flew in Afghanistan was escorting a medevac, and it's pitch black, and we're not flying with formation lights, and that was another big thing because in the States or in Germany where we are, you always had to fly with formation lights, and so you're getting used to flying without formation lights. And with the system, you had to constantly tune it because there's something that's called IR crossover. So at night, as temperatures change, what happens is grass cools down at a different rate than rocks do, than water does. And so what you have is a crossover where grass starts to look like rocks or a mountain starts to look like water. And so you would tune the sensor to adjust for the thermal differentiation. The problem is ours were old sensors. They have newer ones now that are much better. You could tune it to either see the helicopter or see the ground, and you couldn't do both usually. And so you're tuning it and hoping that the guy or girl that's flying lead isn't going to fly you into the side of the mountain because you can't see the mountain. You're looking at the helicopter. Right. And so we're coming into this fob in the middle of nowhere that's blacked out that I've never flown before, and the Blackhawks can haul ass. Like they're really fast. We're really slow because we're underpowered. There's a guy who's in trouble. That's why they're doing the medevac. And he's like, I'm just going to go and get him. And I was too naive to say, no, there's a reason why I'm flying behind you. And I'm like, okay, fine, get him. So he shoots the approach and everything first. And I'm coming in and I'm looking. I've never seen it under the daytime. I'm looking under the system, trying to figure out where the landing spot is that we're supposed to go. And so my front seater was a really good stick. We flew together a lot. And he was flying goggles. And so he had a much better picture, and he was a good pilot. And he's like, I'll shoot the approach. And I'm like, fine, I'll just sit back here and take a nap. And so as he's shooting the approach, a common thing, they say the hardest maneuver in a helicopter is to shoot the normal approach, because what you're doing, if this is your intended point of touchdown, you have this 45-degree line that you're trying to stay on. And as the helicopter gets lower, you got to add more power to stay on the line. If you add too much, you pull off of it. And so as we're shooting the approach, he got too steep and he lost the sight of the landing zone. And so then you could do two things. We could do a go around, but I'm like, man, I don't know where I am. I've already done this once. I don't want to go out in the mountain and come back and find it again. And so because I had the system on, I'm essentially looking through the floor of the helicopter, and I couldn't see the Blackhawk very well, but I knew he'd moved, and I saw the two heat puddles from his engine where he'd just been, and I'm like, well, he was there, so I'm going to go with the notion that it's clear and shoot my approach to that. And so once you get used to it, it works really, really well. And in Apache, you sit one behind the other like this. And so the only way the front seater can see you, there's a little $5 mirror, a rear view mirror that he or she can look up into and see you, but it's hard to pass targets back and forth. And so that's another thing you can do with the HDU is if I'm looking at something I want you to see, I can just put my eyeball on it and say gunner target, and what you get in your eye are cueing dots that tell you where to move your head, and then there's a little cross that comes into your line of sight that shows you what I'm looking at. And so it's really, really nifty once you figure it out, but it is a steep learning curve, and that's why I think the Blackhawk takes about 6 weeks or so to do the transition. The Apache, I think the Alpha model took 4 or 5 months. It's the longest one, and it's mainly because of that, because it's so hard to learn how to fly that system when you're starting.
So, I mean, it sounds like you'd much rather I mean, the current one is much, much better.
Yeah.
It's not just a little better. It's substantially better.
Yeah.
Despite the weight issues.
Yeah, so they're actually a model beyond that now. So what I started what was called the Alpha model, and then we transitioned to what's called the Longbow, the Delta model, and now they're at an Echo model, the Guardian. And so as part of, I think they did it with later Longbows, and then certainly with the Guardians, they retrofitted all the sensors and did all, and so it's much, much better engines, better everything. And so what we had, the difference between the two airplanes is that an Alpha model is very much kind of like the analog gauges and everything. The Longbow is all flat screens. And so it's beautiful because you can each configure, you call it a page. Like if I want to look at an engine page and a nav page, my front seater can say, well, I want to look at a weapons page and something else. And so you configure your cockpit how you want it. And then what's also awesome is there's two different sensors. So there's a little one that looks like a ball that sits on the nose that usually the pilot uses, and there's a much bigger one called the TADS, and it's called the Target Acquisition and Designation Sensor, because in the Army everything is complicated. and so it's a much bigger sensor, and it's more powerful, and it's one that you use to shoot a laser with. And so you can take your MPD, your multi-purpose display, and I can select his or her video to come up underneath of it. And so I get my instruments, and then I can also see exactly what they're looking at. And so and then each helicopter would have its own IP address, so you could data burst targets between them. And so it was amazing, but it was a little bit of a bear to fly in the summertime in Afghanistan.
Oh, I bet. I know the F-35, I think, has a very similar, I don't know if it works the same, but you can look through the cockpit, like everything's invisible, you know, like all the instruments disappear, and now you're looking at the sky effectively, or thermal version of the sky. I always thought that was for the OODA loop variants or whatever, better visibility. I can look in any dimension, any direction, doesn't matter, and zoom in, zoom out, and now I can see whatever the plane could theoretically see if it was a big eye.
Yeah, and my understanding with the F-35 too, a couple things. So instead of having this little thing sitting against your eye, it's got the visor, and then they also have a sensor fusion thing where they're taking, radar, thermal, a whole bunch of things and presenting the best picture to the pilot. And so that's the biggest thing, is you want the pilot focused outside. And what we saw with the Longbow, honestly, when we were starting, is there's so many more buttons to push now that guys and girls would have their heads down. And so there's something, the Alpha model didn't really have an autopilot. The Longbow had a hover hold that you could click on, and it's cued to the GPS, and it does a pretty good job. But what you'd see is I'd click on the hover hold, like in a gunnery or something, and I'm getting something ready, and the co-pilot gunner's down pushing buttons, and I'm pushing buttons, and you're like, who's flying the helicopter right now? Like Boeing is, because neither of us are flying. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, because pilots, especially gunship pilots, are attracted to shiny objects. So if you give them more things to look at and more things to do, you got to still be careful that their heads aren't staying inside the cockpit.
Interesting. So is hovering a difficult task?
It is.
Doesn't seem like it would. I mean, knowing nothing about flying airplanes or helicopters, it seems like hovering should be the easiest of all of those things.
I might have to walk out of this interview.
I know, but it just seems like intuitively, because I mean, you're not instructing it to go any dimension. You don't have to understand axis. You're basically, it seems like if you took your hands off of everything, as long as you had the same amount of power, it would just stay put. But
you are a child of summer. That's what I'm saying right now.
That is not.
So what you have to understand, the difference between a helicopter and an airplane is an airplane likes you and a helicopter wants to kill you. And so a helicopter is specifically when you're hovering, it does not want to hover. It is the
why?
Because what you have is a whole bunch of forces all acting in opposition to each other. So for instance, when you're hovering, what you have to figure out, and the way you learn how to hover, you have what's called a stick buddy, which is in flight school, they divide all the students into pairs of two. And so one instructor pilot and two students. And so what happens is when you go to fly, you fly and your stick buddy sits in the back seat, and you go and fly out to some field, and he or she jumps out, and you fly, and then you come back and they fly. And it's a ton of fun for the hovering when you're sitting there watching your buddy trying to hover, and they're sliding all over the field and trying to kill it themselves until you get in. Because what you have to figure out in a helicopter, there are 3 different control inputs that you're making all the time. So with your feet, you're controlling the yaw rate as the nose goes back and forth like this. With your left hands, the collective, you're controlling the helicopter going up and down. And with the cyclic, your right hand, you're controlling how the helicopter slides back and forth. So what you have to be able to do is look at the world and see how it's moving and realize which combinations of that. Is it sliding? Is it turning? Is it going up and down? And so that's what's really hard about it. And in fact, what happens is your instructor pilot will pass you one set of controls at a time and say, hey, I just want you to try and keep the nose straight. You work the pedals, I got everything else. And so you kind of see what that does, and then he'll take that back and she'll pass you the collective and say, just stay at the same altitude. And you're going up and down and up and down. And then the same thing with the cyclic and as you're doing it. And so what happens is there comes a point where you're not really hovering, because when you do it right, when people are good, you see they just make kind of minute adjustments. What you do when you're student is called stirring the pot, and what you're doing is putting in so many different adjustments that the helicopter can't figure out what to do, and it just kind of stares there. And so there's a moment when you finally master a hover, and that day your instructor pilot gives you your hover card, and it has this little aviator who's walking, chewing gum, and swinging a yo-yo or something at the same time, and it's a huge rite of passage to finally be able to hover. It gets harder in the field in Afghanistan specifically because the way that you hover is you have to be able to see the world because you're making adjustments to visual. Well, in Afghanistan, a lot of times you get into what's called brownout, where as you're hovering, the downdraft from the rotor is kicking up dirt and dust, and so you lose all visual horizon or you lose anything. And so that's when that hover hold can save your life, because you click it on and then take your hands off the controls and the helicopter comes to a rock solid hover, and then as the dirt kind of assuages and stuff, you can do it. The other thing that made it harder for Apaches is we were very power limited, and so a Black Hawk could come in and come to a high hover and slowly come down. We didn't have the power to do that. And so you're committed. And so if you brown out as you're coming in, you're basically transitioning to an instrument landing, which means you're just piling it on the ground. And it was even worse taking off. There was a place called Bamiyan that was about 7,000 feet MSL. And so it was, you think Mile High Stadium is 5,000 feet. This was another 2,000 feet above that. And so we're really, really power limited. And so it's this dirt runway, and the Chinook, he's got power for miles, and so he just takes straight off and go. I can't even pick up to a 2-foot hover, let alone a 3-foot. And so what you do is you go rolling down this runway, and you tell your front seater, and like, hey, if I vary more than 2 degrees in heading, call it out. You know, be ready to punch the stores off if I'm going in. And you divide up between the two of you the workload. And as you're taking off, and just when you start to climb out, you completely brown out. And so you're literally holding that, and it's the longest 15 seconds of your life, because you can't see anything. You don't have any visual references. You're basically flying off instruments until you can fly out of that brown cloud. And it's terrifying.
Wow. That is crazy. I remember reading somewhere the difference between a Cobra and a Apache. Mm-hmm. One of the major upsides was that it has wheels. Mm-hmm. Like not a minor upside. It's really nice because you can taxi around and you can actually get some speed on the ground. And
yeah. You can do so first of all, the difference between an Apache and a Cobra is kind of like the difference between a scooter and a Mustang. Like one of them is a fun thing to show mom and dad, but then another one is a war fighting machine. And so one of the things that you can do because you have wheels is called a max performance takeoff, and that's what I was talking about, where if you don't have enough power to pick up to a hover because you have wheels, you can roll down the runway or the dirt strip until you hit that about 20 knots and it lets you fly out. The same thing when you land. We used to say skids were for kids, and so I don't know if the Marines like that or not. What I do know is that the SEALs were very, very happy when the Apaches came in and the Cobras left. But I say that tongue in cheek. When we were in Afghanistan, the unit before us were Marine Cobra pilots, and so we replaced them. The difference, all kidding aside, the difference is that Cobra is the only aircraft in the Army's inventory, maybe in the military's inventory, that's gone through every single letter of the alphabet. And so it started as an Alpha model Cobra back in Vietnam. It is now a Zulu model Cobra, however many years later. And so what that means, that airframe is very, very tiny. And so what they've had to do is like bolt on things to it. And so literally when you try and climb in that stuff, because I did it with the Marines, ours, especially the Longbow, it looks like a Star Wars cockpit or something. It's beautiful. It's ergonomic. You got space. When you try and get in that Cobra, they got like this box bolted to the cockpit over here and this other squirrely thing over here. And it's because that airframe has been around for so long that they've had to try and upgrade it. And the other thing, one of the best parts about being an Apache is that 30 millimeter gun that hangs underneath of you. And so when it goes off, it's like your chest just, it's the best feeling in the world. And you just look at stuff and squeeze the trigger and it goes away. The Cobra has a cannon too, or a machine gun or Gatling gun, but it doesn't shoot those big 30 millimeter rounds. The Apache shoots the same round as the A10 does. Now, ours are a lot smaller. Theirs are about this long, so there's a lot more power behind it, but it's a great size round and it just tears up, equipment, things like that. So it's really good.
Excuse me. So I have to ask this question because it's always been a really curious thing, but I'm going to ask it. Tell me from your perspective after I tell you this story.
Yeah.
So a guy I know worked in a position where he was doing sort of construction and surveying work or whatever. And he was out in the middle of some field somewhere and some Apache helicopters flying by. He's like, I wonder how far away that is. I actually have no idea. So he lased it. And it's not a visible laser.
Yeah.
But he lased it. And it stopped dead in its tracks, turned, and came right over him and was hovering with the gun pointing at him. And he's like, kind of doing one of these, please don't kill me. It didn't, obviously, and left, and no big deal. What would that have been like had you been in the pilot seat or whatever? What would have gone off? What would have been your...
Yeah, so it depends. Was this in Afghanistan or something?
No, this was in the United States.
Okay.
This is just some random...
We can't be too sure. I mean, you need to check out any potential threat. So it depends on the frequency of the laser and stuff. The Apache has what's called a ACE, aircraft survivability equipment. And so what you have is one of those screens you can pull up basically shows you threats that can be threat lasers, it can be threat radar detectors, things like that. And it could potentially come up if it was the right frequency and mimic something like that. What happened in Afghanistan that was pretty terrifying along those same lines is in Afghanistan, we were terrified about the surface-to-air missile threat. So everybody thought there were if you remember back in the 80s, late 80s, we were funding the Mujahideen and we gave them a whole bunch of stingers.
Yeah.
So everybody was convinced there were stingers out there. In fact, the Afghans, it was kind of a thing of prestige to say that you had a stinger, and they would call anything that looked like that a stinger. And so maybe it was a stinger, maybe it was an SA-7, maybe it was something else, but stinger was kind of the generic term for it. And so in Iraq, a lot of helicopters were shot down by surface-to-air missiles, and to the point where at one point during the war, they quit letting Chinooks fly during the daytime because they were such big targets and they were just getting thrashed by surface-to-air missiles, the little man-pad shoulder-fired missiles. So before we went to Afghanistan, they upgraded the Blackhawks and Chinooks, where before we had a bucket and you could put chaff in there that you would blow out if it was a radar-guided missile, or you could turn it upside down and put flares in there that it would shoot out if it was a man-pad. And that works well in theory, or it works if you're an Air Force plane at 20,000 feet and you have time. If you get shot at by an RPG or a man-pad, it happens so fast it's either going to hit you or miss you, and there's very little you're going to be able to do about it, and you're not going to be able to react in time to kick off flares or something. And so they came up with this great invention where they had a sensor that would look across the thermal spectrum, and what it was supposed to see is like the flare from a launch of a missile, and it would kick out the flares automatically. And they're even more advanced now. I think they might even be able to, they look like a Doppler radar or something to be able to try and see the projectile. And so the unit before us had been flying those and had the Chinooks and Blackhawks outfitted with them. Well, the Afghan kids figured out that if you took a mirror and you hit that sensor just right, it would kick out flares. And they thought that was great fun because the helicopter would buy and they do it. So somehow that little bit of intel did not get passed to us. In my first or second mission, I'm escorting a Blackhawk, and I just see these flares kick out the side, and I look left, and I think what are muzzle flashes. I can see these things. And so I literally WAS'd the rockets. I activated the rockets, banked it over, and was getting ready to kick off a salvo of rockets when my front seater's like, stop, they're kids. And it was literally a school and a bunch of kids flashing the mirrors and stuff. But it was that kind of thing where they did a good job, I think, of getting you ready to go there, but also making sure you understand that when you pulled the trigger, you can't ever get that shot back. And so you were, most of the time, in our rules of engagement were different than the special operations folks or the tier 1 units that had much more permissive ones. And so there were many times in Afghanistan where I remember popping over a hillside and seeing a bunch of guys on the ground with AK-47s, and they're looking at me and I'm looking at them, and I'm like, are they bad guys? Are they just, everybody in Afghanistan has an AK-47? What we use, the kind of part of our rules of engagement is if they have an RPG, they're a bad guy. If they have an AK-47, maybe they're a bad guy. And so we did a lot more of trying to get people to shoot at us so that we would know they were bad guys versus shooting first and potentially, in that case, it would have been tragic, shooting at a bunch of kids who were, flashing the mirror. But you're constantly trying to figure out, are they bad guys? Are they just normal people walking around with it? And the Taliban's smart, right? There's a perception, I think, that we were fighting cavemen. And maybe from a technology perspective, that's true. But they also had, 20 or 30 years worth of light infantry training to become very, very good at what they did. In fact, when you would fly, before we went to Afghanistan, our squadron commander was really good about trying to prepare us from a history perspective. What happened to the Russians? There's a book called The Bear Went Over the Mountain where it talks about, we had to read all of these books. And when you're flying in Afghanistan, no kidding, you'd see burned out BMPs or burned out BTRs that were the same place that they ambushed the Russians that they're, waiting for the Americans, and probably the same place they ambushed the British however many years ago. And so it was very much where, and so part of that is they would know what our rules of engagement were. They would know how to use those against us. They would know when I was there, they came down to the change of rules of engagement where they didn't want you to go do a raid on a compound unless you let Karzai know before, and then he could let the mayor of that place know before. And one of the SEAL teams, and so what happened is the SEAL teams or the special operations folks would hit these compounds and nobody'd be there. Well, surprise, surprise, when you tell the bad guys that you're coming or you tell enough Afghans word get to it. And so there's a SEAL team we supported, SEAL Team 10, where they said, we're just going to go hit the compound. We know it's right outside of Bagram. We know it's a bomb maker. My best friend was the troop commander. He supported that mission. They went right outside the compound, grabbed the guy, bomb maker, stuff everywhere, not even under consideration. They did not, however, inform anybody that they were going to go get this guy. The people protested in front of Bagram, and the chain of command buckled, and we turned that guy loose. And so What we got, the aviators got, is the SEALs took his AK-47, mounted it to a plaque, and gave it to our squadron and said, at least we got to keep his gun. And that was, and that was Afghanistan, right? I think, and that's part of that, what comes into my book, I think, is just this frustration, this quagmire that happened, for 20 years of war, and say, can anybody articulate to me what the tactical goals are right now? Can anybody articulate to me what winning looks like right now? Or are we just, in a place of entropy where we've rotated people here over and over again, and we continue to do that? And that was, for me, my son was born shortly after September 11th. He is pursuing a career in the military. He's going to be commissioned as a Marine Corps officer once he graduates from college, and I'm very, very proud of that. But as a father, I just felt, felt it that abhorrent that a generation of kids later might have to go back to Afghanistan, and we didn't even know why. And so I think I don't want to say most veterans, but most folks I talked to agreed with that, and were ready for us to be done with Afghanistan. But the way in which we were done is what, called everything under question and said, it can't end this way. The sacrifices we made, the people we lost, the blood and treasure we poured in this place, this can't be how it ends. And that was how it ended.
Yeah. So, if you wouldn't mind, I'd really like to talk about Operation Red Wings.
Yeah.
I know that you were flying in that arena. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So what happened? Operation Red Wings was originally planned to be a operation for the Marines, and so, like I said, we supported a Marine battalion that was down in Jalalabad, and the Marines didn't have their own organic air, and so what they would do is sometimes they'd come to us, sometimes they would try and get the air to be able to do the air assault and stuff that Red Wings required. Well, the SEAL teams are a different customer and a different tier customer, and so when they request aviation, they can get it most of the time. And we ended up working quite a bit with the SEAL teams there because of that. In fact, every special operations team, or most everyone that would rotate into country, we would take them across the river there at Bagram and shoot with them. So they would get used to calling Apaches in. And, small world, one of the times I'm shooting, it's just the range, but I'm shooting for this ODA, this Green Beret team, and the voice on the radio sounds familiar, and I'm like, I know that guy from somewhere. And all of a sudden he said, Don, is that you? And it was, no kidding, a guy that I went to ROTC with that was now the captain on the ground of that Special Forces A team, and I'm shooting rockets over his head. And so
don't miss.
Yeah, there's actually, I'll deviate a little bit from that. So when we would do that, we'd give them a card and say, here's how you call for a close combat air attack, CCAs. But really what I need to know is where they are and where you are. And so don't make it super complicated. Tell me where you are. Tell me where the target is. And if you can designate the target, that's better. And there's all kinds of ways they can designate. At night, they can use lasers. They can use their 50 cals. And so it's in the daytime, and we're shooting for them. And so they start off shooting with their 50 cal, and you can see really easy where the rounds are impacted. And so we're putting rockets and 30 on it. And then they're moving it in closer and moving it in closer. At one point, they're using kind of their small arms to designate. And it's a little harder, but I can see where the dirt's kicking up. And so my front seater at the time is a different front seater from my Red Wings. He's like, sir, I don't know if we should shoot it. That's awful close. I'm like, by God, they called us in. We're going to shoot it. Give me the gun. And so I took the gun, did a gun run, and I noticed that guys were diving under their Humvees and stuff as I'm doing the gun. And so as I'm pulling off, my friend Doug gets on the radio, and he's like, I didn't think you'd really shoot that close. And I'm like, if you didn't want me to shoot, don't call me in. And so that was the kind of stuff that you get used to, because the first time you ever do, we would call it a bump. And so what would happen is, if the bad guys are here, what you would do is you'd fly parallel to the target, you'd bump up, turn over, shoot rockets, and then as you'd brake, the front seater would cover the brake with the 30 millimeter. And when you get really good at it, one gun is braking just as the other gun's rolling in. And so they're constantly putting fire on target. Well, the first time you do a bump and you see the good guys and the target in your windscreen at the same time, that's kind of a defining moment. And you're like, This isn't training anymore. This is for real. If I don't do this right, God forbid I could, hit Americans or something. And so for Red Wings, what happened is that the SEALs said, okay, we will get you aviation, but we want to be part of it too. And so I was in Afghanistan. You have 3 different mission sets as an Apache person. You have the quick reactionary force, which you normally did for 10 or 12 days, and it would be a day shift where it might be 4 a.m. till 4 p.m, and then you'd usually have 24, 48 hours off, and you'd rotate, and then you'd take the night shift. And so you would be the 911 force for Bagram. And so what happened, if you'd carry a little walkie-talkie, and if you got a call on that radio, you'd have to be airborne within 30 minutes. And it could be anything. It could be there's just a general who wants to fly to Kabul and he needs Apache escort. It could be that there's a Black Hawk or Chinook that needs to go make a run, or maybe they need to do a medevac thing, or there's what we call the TIC, a troops in contact. It could be anything. And so you would do that. The second kind of mission type is what's called a ring route, where the Blackhawks and Chinooks would take supplies from fob to fob, and you would fly escort for them. And so those were usually kind of boring, but they'd be a lot of flight hours. It'd be 7 or 8 hours just flying from point to point, and you're protecting. We used to call it, trolling with a Chinook or trolling with a Blackhawk, because you'd throw that line out and you'd let that helicopter fly straight and level, and then you'd be kind of the hound dog going from either side, checking out the cliffs, trying to see if anybody's going to shoot at them, because you wanted them in front of you so that if they drew fire, you could turn around and roll in on that, versus if you flew first, the Taliban would let you fly by and then engage the Chinook. And then the third kind of operation, which is what Red Wings ended up being, was a deliberate or direct action one. So that's where you plan, hey, we're going to go hit a compound, we're going to do whatever, and the Apaches are going to do the close combat support for it. So the escort, clear the landing zone, and then once the guys on the ground are kicking indoors and doing their thing, the Apaches are flying support for them. So I was, for the Red Wings, I just happened to be on QRF for that day. So I wasn't part of the planning. I remember the mission getting briefed, but I knew I wasn't up to do the direct action or anything like that. And so what happened is that when the 160th were the folks, the Special Operations Army Aviation were the ones that put the SEALs in. And what we were saying before, I can't remember if this was on the tape or not, is that traditionally the 160th and general aviation, like what I was, we didn't work together very often. And so the 160th obviously has a different mission set than general aviation. They traditionally have their own fire support assets. So they have either the little birds, the little Magnum PI helicopters that have rockets and miniguns on it. They have the DAPs, the dual action penetrators. But in Afghanistan, where we were operating, it was too high for the little birds to be able to fly there. And most of the 160th DAPs, I think, were in Iraq at the time, supporting customers there. And so what would happen is we would get the SEALs would ask for Apache support, and so we would often get pulled into 160th missions where you'd go down to the compound, you'd kind of brief them. But everything that it wasn't, so the other organic air assets in our task force, the Chinooks, the Blackhawks, we had trained with them for months before deploying, because we all came from Germany together. We did joint missions together. So we knew how they worked. We were very familiar with them. The 160th were different, and they have a different mission set. And so it was probably a little more of a learning curve working with them, and frankly, them working with us, than it was our organic assets. And so I knew that Red Wings was going on kind of peripherally. It wasn't going to be my mission. I was just doing QRF that day. And so the night before, the 160th put that 4-man SEAL team in that had Mike Murphy, Lieutenant Mike Murphy was the commander, and then Marcus Luttrell and Danny Dietz and Matt, missing the fourth guy's name. So they put them in as a kind of a scout sniper team. And so when I came on QRF duty that morning, whatever time it was, usually what happens is if it was 4 a.m., you'd go down, pre-flight the helicopter, run it up, make sure there's no problems, pre-flight the backup, make sure that you had an aircraft to bump to, and then you would come up to the TOC or the Tactical Operations Center, and they'd give you kind of a briefing of what the day looked like. Here are the missions we know about. Here are the things we think might happen. Here's current intelligence, weather, all that stuff. So I remember at the briefing them saying something to the effect of, hey, there was a SEAL team that was put in last night. We've lost comms with them. It might turn into something, kind of be ready for it. Now, there isn't, a whole lot you can do to be ready for it. And so I went about my day, and at some point that morning, I can't remember when it was, my radio went off. And so what happens when your radio goes off, and the guy I flew with was an amazing front seater. Like I said, we were crewed together quite a bit. He was another captain, and that didn't happen a lot. It's usually what we call a commissioned officer, which is, 01 through 0 whatever, and then a warrant officer are crewed together, or 2 warrants are. I was fortunate enough that I made pilot command, and so I could fly with another, because commissioned officers, at least back then, weren't often pilot in command, so it was normally warrant officers. So the two of us had flown together a lot. He was the one I was talking about before, that our first mission where he lost sight of the landing zone and I had to use the system to shoot it. And so we had kind of a routine down where he would run for the TOC to get an update, and I would run for the helicopter to run it up. And so you usually have a pair of Apaches that are on QRF duty. So the other crew was Mark Rudy, who was a maintenance test pilot, and then Dan Bryce, who was my XO. So I was a commander, Dan was my XO. And they were their wingman. And so Mark and I went to go run up the helicopters. I don't know if Dan went with Mark or he went to the TOC or not, but Alex, who was my front seater, came running back, and he's like, it's the SEAL mission. And he's like, we've got a grid coordinate, a call sign, and a frequency, and that's all we had. And so we were in Bagram, and what our mission was to fly down to Jalalabad, where the Marines were. And there were a couple Blackhawks that were loading up with Marines as a quick reactionary force. We'd link up with the Blackhawks and then fly all of them up to that grid coordinate that we had. That was the last known point of contact for the SEALs. And so we got up and took off flying for Jalalabad. And I remember at the time thinking, that it was fantastic. It was kind of like your dad finally gave you the keys to the car. Like, this is what you trained for your entire life. This is what you are supposed to do as an Apache pilot, is go save the good guys and put steel on target. And so as we're landing in Jalalabad, I remember seeing a Chinook take off, and I knew it was a 160th Chinook because they're the only ones that have the refueling probes on the front. So they have the big, long refueling probe on the front of the helicopter. And so I came in to land, and I think it was 2 other Blackhawks, and I remember looking up and thinking, I wonder where that guy's going. And then went and made contact with the Blackhawks that were already there. I gave an air mission brief. What you have is you try and take as much workload off you as possible, because combat is really stressful and it's complex and things are training. So we had a whole, just like the close combat attacks I talked to you about before, we had a knee board page that we would give people and say, this is the format you're going to follow, and you'd have that in the aircraft so you'd know what to expect. The same thing, we had a template for an ad hoc air mission brief that you could just give on the fly. And so I remember opening my knee board, giving the air mission brief, and we took off, and we flew the way that we normally flew, where the Blackhawks were in the lead, we were behind them. And the landing zone, the proposed landing zone, or the last known grid coordinate, was really high. It was up on this mountain. And so as we're coming up onto that mountain, weather's starting to come down a little bit. There's a little bit of kind of fog and stuff coming in. It's really, really high. And we were power limited. And so I had to call the Blackhawks a couple times and like, you got to slow down because you're going to overrun me. You got to slow down. And so as we're coming up the side of the mountain, I see 2 Chinooks coming in and joining our formation. And it was, one of them was the Chinook I saw take off of Jalalabad. And I can't remember how we figured out who they were, because the 160th has slightly different fills too sometimes than we do. So the way a radio works, the way they make it secure, is that every day you load what's called the fill into it, and it's like a cipher basically, and it changes every day, and you have to sync it. Well, if 2 radios don't have the same cipher, even if you're on the same frequency, you can't talk, or sometimes there's some bleed over between it. And so we could kind of talk to them, but not really. And there was an A-10 that was flying overhead that was doing kind of command and control. And he could look down, because we're coming up these valleys trying to get to the mountain. And so he can see both the landing site that we're at as well as the helicopters. And so as we're somehow, I don't remember how, we figured out who they were and that they had the SEAL quick reactionary force with them as well. And so there was 2 Chinooks out ahead of us, the 2 Blackhawks, and then me and my wingman that are coming up. And so as we're getting closer, I remember either I did or my front seater, I can't remember which of us, made the radio call and said, hey, I can't remember if we did it directly to the Chinook or the A-10 relayed it to him, but it said, you got to tell those guys to slow down, because they're going to beat us to the landing zone. You have to tell them to slow down. And so the SOP would be that at what's called the release point, the aircraft you were escorting would slow down, the Apaches would come forward, and then you would clear the landing zone. And so you're looking, are there bad guys there or not? You're flying around, you're trying to get them to shoot at you, and so you would drop flares on the landing zone or something to try and see if there are bad guys there. And so what you would do is call the landing zone cherry or ice. And so if it was cherry, you'd wave the helicopters off. If it's ice, it's a cold landing zone, the helicopters could come in. And then as soon as the helicopters took off, you would transition to the role of doing close combat attacks for the guys on the ground. And so the Blackhawks or Chinooks would take off, and then you're being a gunship pilot. And so I remember saying to him, like, you got to slow down. We're not going to be able to get to the landing zone before you did. And then they came back and said, negative, you can clear the landing zone. Once you get there, we're going. And then the very next radio call, I remember.
How far ahead were they at this point?
I think far enough ahead from where I was flying that I couldn't see them at this point.
Wow.
And so because the next radio call came from either the Black Hawk that was at the front of the formation or the A-10 overhead, and he said, so the Chinook, the 1/60th version is called an MH-47 instead of a CH. And he said the MH is down, the MH is down, the MH is down. And so they called that right as I was flying a beam, the Black Hawks, to pass them. And so the landing zone was kind of over here. As we're coming up, that Chinook gets shot down, and so the Black Hawk flight turns into us, and it was grace of God that there wasn't just a midair collision right there. And so I, banked the helicopter over as far as I could go and ended up going. And so the mountain's like this, and there were a couple different valleys that kind of led up to it, and I went down one valley, the Black Hawks pulled off another one, and I completely lost my wingman. And I remember thinking, I could hear the radio traffic and hear them saying, the MH is down. And I just remember thinking in my head, I'm like, this is Black Hawk down right now. Like, this isn't supposed to happen. Like, how in the world is this Chinook gone? Like, what's happening? And I remember in the first minute or two, it was all I could do was to fly the helicopter, because I had almost hit a Black Hawk. I was afraid I was going to hit the terrain. And so in that moment, all you're thinking about is kind of survival. And then my front seater's like, we got to get in there. And I'm like, by God, he's right. We do have to get in there. That's our job. But I wanted to link up with my wingman, and I couldn't find him because we'd gone down separate valleys. And so the A-10, again, had to link me back up with my wingman, where he's literally like, turn, stop, turn, all right, go. And so we're coming in to try and find this helicopter. And he's like, and the A-10 was trying to give us directions and stuff. And I was like, this can't be right, because there's nothing that looks like a helicopter. It was just waves and waves of fire everywhere on the side of the mountain. And we found out later what happened is the Chinook came to a hover to let the SEALs fast rope out. It got hit by an RPG, and it kind of did this and then hit the side of the mountain and tumbled down. But all I could see was just fire everywhere. And I'm like, this can't be the right spot. Like, there's nothing here that even looks like a helicopter. And so the A-10 at the time was right before that, I couldn't, I'm telling this a little out of story. So after the Chinook was shot down, the A-10 rolled in and started firing white phosphorus rockets, because what he was trying to do was to keep the Taliban from overrunning the crash site by, from my perspective, all I could see was things blowing up all over the place, and all I could see was fire everywhere. And I'm like, I don't know what the crash site is. All I can see is everything burning. And so I was convinced that we weren't even at the crash site, that he had shot something, and what we saw burning where the rockets were. And so he was trying to use his laser to guide us to where it is. And we couldn't see it. It wasn't in the visible spectrum, but you can do this thing where you dial up the laser code, and then you can get the sensor to slave to it. So you still can't see the sensor, but it's like kind of like a dog that points at birds. It goes, chunk. And so you can see where it is. And I'm like, we couldn't get the laser to work, or we couldn't either catch his laser or where he was pointing. I'm like, it can't be that. And so then he actually went into verbal commands, and he's like, all right, start a right turn, stop, turn, hold. And so he vectored us over the crash site. And I'm like, all I could see was fire everywhere. All I could see. And so we didn't have, at the time, the Longbows didn't have SATCOMs, and so we couldn't call back to our headquarters or see what's going on or anything. We could talk to him, and he could kind of talk to him, and I'm like, we're Apaches, by God. This is what we do. We're going to fly over. If this is the crash site, let's see if we can find anybody. And so what we ended up doing was that the mountain was so high, by the time we climbed up to it, you're barely doing 60 or 70 knots. Now, a helicopter is hard to shoot down with an RPG if it's moving, because if a helicopter is doing 100 knots and you're perpendicular to it, you have to lead that helicopter with the RPG. So unless it's coming straight for you or it's at a hover, it's much harder to hit. But we were going slow by the time that we got up there, that I told our wingman, Mark Rudy, who was a courageous guy, I was like, you got to fly low and see if you can draw fire. And if I see something, I'll roll in on them from above you. And so he's literally flying over the crash site and doing this, going sideways, trying to see something. And I'm trying to figure out if I can see any flashes, if I can see any survivors, if I can see anything. And at one point, I was looking over to my right, and as we came up over the hill, a guy popped up and shot an RPG at us. And so my front seater, Alex, played lacrosse. He was a college lacrosse player. And he said later, he's like, it was half a lacrosse field away. He was 50. And at that distance, like, it was grace of God. I don't know how he missed us. And so it was, in my head, you talked about OODA loop before. I'm still trying to process, like, what is going on? What, I feel like I'm back on my heels. Like, I just got hit by Mike Tyson. I'm trying to figure it out. And so when they shot the RPG, Alec had the gun slaved to his eye. And so he looked and tried to squeeze the trigger, but there's something that happens where when the gun tilts too far, there's a software limit, so it won't shoot, the helicopter itself. And so it couldn't shoot. But what he said was, we're taking fire. And as goofy as it sounds, like, that is what completely broke my logjam, because when we practiced it over and over and over again in the simulator, that's the command you would give, is we're taking fire, and then you execute the battle drill. And so as soon as he said, we're taking fire, in my head, I was like, okay, I know this feels familiar now. And you make that transition from, I'm terrified and I don't know what's going on, to you're angry and how dare they shoot at us, and we're going to light up this entire hillside. And so then as we started to come around, and I had kind of, when it rains, it pours. So there's something that's called an intercom cable, an ICS cable that goes to your helmet and it plugs in. And so it gets a lot of wear and tear. And so sometimes you'll get little shorts in it. Well, I had shorts in it off and on, and it happens quite a bit. And I was like, I should take it in and get looked at. And I'm like, next flight. Well, Murphy's Law, that thing started going out, and I couldn't talk to Alec anymore. And so you can't, there's a blast shield between you, so you can't talk. And so at times, to get his attention, I was flying with one hand, and then I'd pound on the blast shield with my head, and he'd look up, and I'd be like, we're going to shoot him. We're going to do. And so, all of this crazy stuff happens, but once we get shot at, then you're like, oh, no, they didn't. No, they didn't just shoot at us. And so then I was like, I was the rockets. I'm like, we're just going to put rockets down on the side of this hill. And so as I started to come in, Alex, to his credit, is like, you can't just shoot. We don't know where the survivors are. There might be, the original SEALs might be there. And so you go from this thing of, like, being scared out of your mind to then hyper aggressive, where you just want to rain down hellfire on everybody. And that was the right call and a good call by him. And I was like, okay, what we're going to do is just fly back and forth until we run out of gas, and see if we can get somebody to shoot at us that the A-10 can see, to see if we can get some survivors, to see if we can find anybody. Because the Taliban were super smart. They didn't want to mess with Apaches. And you could see later the Taliban, released some pretty horrific video on YouTube and stuff like that. And you can actually see us, and you can see them shooting at us, and then them, like, wrapping their arms around trees and stuff like that. Because we can't, at that point, the sensors were really good at picking up a Russian tank, but not very good at picking up a human body from close. And so you're doing it by eye as you're flying by over this mountain, trying to find bad guys and stuff. And so we just crisscross that field over and over again. And at one point, Dan, who was in the front seat of Mark's helicopter, he's like, I got a guy. And I'm like, Is it a SEAL? And he's like, I don't know. He just put up his hands when I went by. And so they were super smart about that stuff too, right? Like, if they get caught in the open, they know you see a dude could be a goat herder. He could be the Taliban guy. And that's why aviation, or attack aviation, is very effective in conjunction with people on the ground for this mission. But it's kind of like a little bit like what you see in Ukraine right now, where the Russian armor is getting slaughtered because they don't have infantry that's there to protect them as they're doing it. We fight best in a combined arms format. And so without a guy on the ground to say, that's a bad guy, or I know there are bad guys on this part of the hill, just put rockets there. Because if we had that, we would shoot all the time for them, because they're the ones who have the situational awareness and can do it. But I was really, really hesitant to shoot at all if I couldn't positively ID the target, or God forbid, there's a survivor and we kill them instead. And so we literally flew over that mountain until we ran out of gas. And as we're coming back, we came down to Asadabad, that was a little tiny fob, and the A-10's change station. And so we got gas, and I said, all right, we're going back. And so the A-10 radioed me, and he said, hey, I talked to your commander or your command back home. They want you guys to come back. You know, the mountain's weathered in. And I'm like, no, we have to. We're the only ones who saw that place, because the A-10 had already changed station by then. And we were cavalry officers, and one of the first fundamentals of the cavalry is to find and maintain contact with the enemy. Like, we knew what it looked like. And they're like, no. You guys have to come home. That's it. It's weathered in. You can't go back there. And so it was one of the worst days of my life, because not only was I didn't do my job and stop that Chinook getting shot down, I didn't fire a single shot. And now if anybody was there or still was alive, they just watched us leave them. And when Marcus Luttrell wrote his book, Lone Survivor, you know, I was paging through to find it, and there's a section in there where he said he watched the Apaches fly away, and it just broke me. And I'm like, that guy was still alive, and we left him on the side of that hill, and it was terrible. And I had to, you know, spent a good part of my life after that figuring out, hey, this is not to equate combat with sports, but the closest analogy I can find is, you know, if you're a professional football player and you spend your entire life trying to get to the Super Bowl, and you walk on the field and you fumble in the first play, and that's it, and that's all you get. And that's what it felt like to me, is that we didn't do our job, we didn't kill any bad guys, and until they had that tragic extortion Chinook shoot down later, the most SEALs in the history of the SEALs were killed on that day, and it happened in my watch, and I couldn't stop it. And so it was a horrible thing to try and deal with, for sure.
Jesus. Have you talked to Marcus Luttrell? I mean, I think he is in Austin or around.
Yeah, he's in Texas. I saw him a little bit on his book tour briefly when he came to Cincinnati. What helped more is that when I got out of the Army, I went to work for a company in Cincinnati, and we had a really big Veterans Affinity group where we would bring in folks. And so there was a local author who wrote a book called Seal of Honor that was just about Mike Murphy and was his story. And he got his parents' permission to write it. And so when I saw this book, which was, I don't know, 2010 or something, I said, we got to bring this guy in, and we got to bring in Mike's family. And so we were able to do that. And Mike's dad, Dan Murphy, was a Vietnam infantryman, Purple Heart, actually got in a firefight on the side of a mountain. And so they came in, and it was my job to introduce them. And I'm trying to introduce him, and, you know, I can't even make it through it. And he just came up and hugged me, and he's like, it's not your fault. And it wasn't anything that anybody else hadn't said, but coming from him, it was completely different. And it was, you know, it wasn't just a dad that was hurting. It was a guy who had been an infantry platoon leader, who had a Purple Heart, who knew that sometimes things just don't go the way you want them to, and people don't come home, and that's part of the deal. And so he was very, very gracious. The whole family was very, very gracious. They invited my wife and I to come up to Bath, Maine when they did the christening for the ship that was named in his honor and stuff. And so we got to do that with them. And I stayed in contact with Mike's mom. For my wife did too for a while. And they're just incredible people. And it's an incredible story, but it was brutal, because when I left when you're in the military, you don't realize how much of your sense of purpose and who you are is tied up in what you do until you leave that and you don't have it anymore. And then the second thing you don't have is the community of people who understand what you're going through and what happened. And so I went from that to working for a great company, but sitting in a cubicle, you know, I told my wife after one of my first days, I was like, I finally get that movie Office Space now. I get the jokes, because that's sort of what I'm at. But for me, it was more, I was like, who am I now? Like, I was terrified by the notion that one day I would have been out of the Army longer than I'd been in it, and then I'd just be another guy sitting in a cubicle. And And then at the same time, I was going through a lot of, I didn't know, I think I met Mike once because we went over to the SEAL compound. We were supposed to do a mission and didn't. And so I didn't know those guys. I didn't, but they died on my watch, and I felt like I should know them, or I should. And so I spent a whole bunch of time trying to find out more about them, to understand them,
There's still time.
Yeah.
I mean,
and I'm
still around.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I have gotten to know more of them now and stuff, but it was hard to deal with. And the other person who helped me a lot was a guy named Nate Self, who wrote a book called Two Wars. And so Nate actually lives in Texas as well. He was a ranger during Anaconda. He was the platoon leader. And so on Roberts Ridge, where Neil Roberts was a SEAL who fell out of the back of the Chinook and was killed. And then Roberts, and his first name escapes me, was the Air Force combat controller that was also killed. Roberts was awarded the Medal of Honor. The SEAL that was, Chapman was awarded the Medal of Honor. The SEAL that was Roberts' team leader, his call sign's Slab, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Nate was sent to go try and rescue what they thought were Roberts and Chapman, and his helicopter was shot down. A bunch of his Rangers were killed, and so he secured that mountaintop, and then the Taliban counterattacked, wounded a bunch more of his guys. He killed the Taliban, secured the mountaintop, and said, okay, we're good, send me a helicopter because these guys are going to die. And they wouldn't send one. And they said, we've already had one helicopter shot down. We had another badly damaged. We're not going to send one until nightfall. And so against everything Nate could do, he had to just sit there and watch these guys die. And that was his story. And so he didn't, when I got to know him and we kind of swapped stories, he just looked at me and he said, it wasn't your fault. And it wasn't, like I said, there wasn't anything magical about those words, but coming from somebody who had been there and experienced it was completely different. It wasn't anything my wife hadn't told me. It wasn't anything everybody, but and that's what I tell other veterans. I'm like, that's why it's so important to stay connected to that community. It's not that you have all the answers. It's that you have that shared experience. It's the same thing. If you found out tomorrow you had stage 4 cancer, the person you'd want to talk to is somebody that survived stage 4 cancer, right? And as a veteran, you have that to offer to other veterans. But what happens is that when you leave the service, you inadvertently cut yourself off from anybody who can offer that to you. And that's why I think that's one of the reasons why the suicide rate is so high. A number of years ago, we reached the point where we were losing more vets to suicides than we were to combat operations. And I think in a large part is because when you're in the military, you carry that because everybody's carrying something and it doesn't seem odd. But when you leave and you have the time to process that on your own, you're dealing with things you weren't dealing with before, and you no longer have the people around you that can help you sort that out.
And enough people with unbelievably sick sense of humor who can get
exactly
you through
right.
it.
Exactly right.
So one of my very good friends, Scott Brauer, who passed somewhat recently, a 20-year Navy SEAL veteran, and this is maybe the second time I met him or something. So I didn't know him that well at this point. I'm like, so out of curiosity, have you seen the movie Lone Survivor? And he kind of shook me off, and I'm like, well, I'm just kind of curious, like, if you've seen it, because I think out of all these movies of that genre, it's probably the most visually accurate. All the things look right in it. And hearing your story, there are some pieces I can tell already that should have been revised, like the weather, for instance. But it's still relatively good story. And he shook me off again, like, no, I haven't. I'm like, oh, you should check it out. And he's like, I'm not going to do that. And I'm like, I thought it was like one of those, like, I don't watch movies, or I don't want to pay for it, or one of those kind of things. I'm like, I'll pay for it if it's one of those. I'm kind of curious just what you think.
Yeah. And
he really was like shaking me off hard, like, and not like he was going to beat me up, but like, stop with doing what you're doing right now. And it didn't quite catch it at the time. So the very next time I saw him, I had time to think about it. And I'm like, I bet he actually knew some of those guys. Yeah. I bet that's what's going on here. And so I said, I don't mean to be disrespectful. I wasn't trying to, incite anything. I was just curious. But now that I think that you probably knew some of those guys, he's like, well, it's worse than that. I was actually supposed to be my team. We just got rotated out. We were a very experienced team. We'd been in there for years. We knew exactly what we were doing, and we would not have made those mistakes because there was a lot of mistakes that had been made that day. And this was a brand new team. This was like, I think maybe one of the very first missions they were on, and they made some mistakes, and you could tell it was just killing him. Yeah. So I think there's other people out there who feel a great deal of personal responsibility, and
Yeah.
There's plenty of blame to go around, but I mean, shit happens too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other part too is I'm sure it's a great movie. I haven't watched it either. I think when you've been to combat and seen stuff like that, it's really hard to watch those movies. And so it would not, my friends, for the last 10 years, I've worked with companies that primarily our customers were in special operations or the intelligence community. And so my coworkers, so Nate was a coworker, his sister platoon leader, Brandon Cates has been my boss 2 different times at 2 different companies. Greg Glass was another ranger that was there on that day. And so when you've seen that, it becomes very hard to watch those kind of movies or realistic movies because it's not entertainment anymore. It reminds you of something that isn't too fun to watch anymore, I think.
I hear you. So how did you make that transition into the workforce? I mean, it didn't seem like you stayed being a civilian too long.
I didn't. I think veterans in general, I think what makes us different is that we're driven more by a sense of purpose than, or potentially that we want to find our sense of purpose in what we do. And so, company I worked at was fantastic, but I needed something that connected me more to kind of that old life again. And so at the time, the FBI was very heavily recruiting folks from the military, and they were recruiting folks who had special operations experience and stuff to form a pipeline for HRT, their hostage rescue team. And then they also needed folks who were pilots because HRT has its own little Air Force kind of thing that's also flown by FBI agents. And so
this isn't just flying in circles all day. This is like actually landing.
No, it's the real deal. They are, HRT is, I had a couple of my classmates try out for HRT. One of them was a former Force Recon Marine. He didn't make it. One of them was he wasn't a CIA paramilitary officer. He's a CIA officer, but he'd done tours of duty and Assadabad and stuff like that, not sitting behind a desk in Washington. He didn't make it. Like, HRT selection is brutal, and they mirror it off of they take a lot from like how Delta Force does their selections and things like that, or the Army Special Forces selections. And so so they also needed pilots. And so what the recruiter did was kind of fast track my application with a handshake deal that I would come back and assess for the HRT Air Force. I can't remember what the real name is. And at the 2-year mark or whatever, when I was eligible to do that. And so I went, and I'd never wanted to be in law enforcement. Wasn't anything that was terribly interested to me, and I applied to everything I think that I could, that I thought would give me a sense of purpose again. And the FBI said yes. And then when I learned more about the FBI, there's 5 different career fields, if you will. You can be an FBI special agent. So there's criminal, which is all I knew about, and it spans the difference from bank robbery to white collar crime and everything in between. And then there's intelligence, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and cyber. And so 4 of those, I guess everything but criminal, have national security aspects to them as well. And so that I was very much interested in. And so I got to go to Quantico, and I got tracked what's called counterintelligence. But when I went to my first field office, I was put instead in what's called the FIG. It's the Field Intelligence Group. And so your job is to run and recruit assets, or what you call assets in the intelligence community, what you call sources in the FBI, and it was a blast. And so it can range the gamut from an agent comes to you and says, hey, I'm working this particular counterterrorism case, and I need a source to better understand what's going on in this organization. Here are a couple potential ones. Can you pitch one for me and do it? Or it could be, we also had the latitude to work kind of more national questions where, if there are a series of standing questions that are things like you can imagine, like I want to know X about this country or something. Well, if you find somebody who might know that, then you have the ability to go pitch them and learn it. And so it's taught very, very well. Like sometime after September 11th, the FBI realized that the way that they were running sources before was kind of the old cop method, where I want you to tell me about this motorcycle gang, so I'm going to arrest you and hold it over your head, and you're going to become my source. Where after 9/11, when the FBI had a much bigger counterterrorism focus, they realized you can't recruit sources that same way, right? Because a lot of them you might want to know about a particular community, or they haven't done anything wrong. You can't hold that above them. And so they really had to look to agencies like the CIA to say, how do you guys do it? How do you recruit assets? What's your methodology for doing that? Because they're not a criminal organization, right? And so the FBI taught that very, very well. And you got in Quantico, it was, they would bring in role players and actors and stuff like that. And then those classes would continue when you went to your field office. And before you'd make a pitch, my training agent was incredible. He had a master's degree in psychology and worked undercover. And so you'd walk through how you're going to do the pitch. What are the things the person potentially would say? How are you going to navigate that? And it was fascinating work, and I loved it. I felt like I was actually in a Tom Clancy movie or something like that. And I was lucky enough at the time to make the SWAT team, and so was doing all of that. And so much to my shame, when the FBI HRT recruiter came back and said, hey, I want you to come assess for the FBI Air Force, I'm like, I'm not doing that. I'm staying in Dallas. We like it here. I'm going to continue to work there. And so I had a great time doing that until what's in an FBI office, they have what's called the SAC, the special agent in charge, and then they have what are called the ASACs, which are kind of his or her deputies that run different areas. And so my ASAC called me in one day, and he's like, man, you're doing a great job in the FIG. And so I can't remember what the terminology is, but when you find out a piece of information that gets disseminated beyond the FBI, gets disseminated, to the greater community, that makes that office look real good. That makes you look real good. And so it's called statting, where as an FBI agent, there are things that you get credit for. And so all of those things combined for your review, and you get stats for, an arrest or whatever it was. And
how good your paperwork is.
Well, my stats were more driven around the assets and stuff I was recruiting. And so I had some pretty good stats. We were having a good time. And so he called me in and he said, you're doing a great job, but you're a new agent. You shouldn't really be in this squad. We're going to move you to an investigative squad. And I was like, oh, well, I'm counterintelligence, so I'm going to the counterintelligence squad. And he's like, no, you're going to the political corruption squad. And so I went from going and meeting dudes in shady alleys and doing Tom Clancy stuff to sitting in a cubicle again. And here's your 10,000 emails and trash bag full of bank records. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is not what I came into the FBI to do. This wasn't, I felt like I was losing that sense of purpose thing of being, that reason for getting up in the morning. And so at the time, Nate had formed this small company with a bunch of his former Army friends. And he's like, why don't you come do this with us? And so I don't know if I would have stayed in that intelligence squad, if I would have said yes, but by then I was like, yes, I'll come do that. And so since then, I've always had a connection to the customer like those SEALs, right? Where I knew that I was giving America's sons and daughters a piece of equipment that they were going to take overseas, and it was going to make them do their job better, and it was going to make them safer. And so the last company I worked for, it's called Amatrine. We were the American subsidiary of an Israeli startup. And so we make uniforms and hide sights and such that make you invisible in the thermal and visual spectrum. And so we're giving stuff to customers, and I know that when they wear our stuff, they're going to be invisible and they're going to come back home. Like I have a great friend who works for Procter and Gamble, and he makes diapers, and the world needs diapers. I have 3 kids. We needed diapers. I don't think I could ever work a job where I was making diapers, because
you'll need diapers again someday.
I will eventually. I might change my mind then, but I looked for that thing that tied me back to the people that I cared about, and was able to do that. And now those are the people that I write about. When my first book, Without Sanction, came out, my protagonist is a guy named Matt Drake, who's a case officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency. And I had a radio interviewer ask me, "Are you Matt Drake?" And I'm like, I am absolutely not Matt Drake, but I've stood in the same room with men who could be. And so now I get to hear their stories, and I get to if you look at my Clancy books, a lot of the characters in there, with their permission, are actually people, all of them are out of the military now, who were special operations. But since I'm the writer, what I do is Brandon Cates was an Army Ranger, and I made him a Navy SEAL. And I took a friend that was a Navy SEAL and made him a Green Beret, just to keep things interesting. But it's, it's kind of that testament where I've been very lucky to know very interesting people. And I get to open kind of a window into that community and say, here's what, like, you hear about them a lot. You hear them on TV, you might see movies and stuff. These are the people that I know that are really like that. And here's a great story about him. And that's what I get to do now.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, how did you get involved with the Tom Clancy Jr. series? Like, how does one get propositioned to do that?
Sheer luck. So there are a lot of Toms to this story. I apologize that in advance. But my editor is a guy named Tom Colgan, and he is edited for everybody from Janet Ivanovich to Lee Child to Tom Clancy when he was still alive. And so when Tom passed away about 10 years ago, the Clancy estate came back to the publisher and said, "Hey, we want Tom's legacy to continue." And so much, every time a new Tom Clancy book of mine comes out, there's always one guy on Facebook that's like, "You should be ashamed of yourself for profiting off Clancy's name." And I'm like, I promise you, I'm not the one profiting off of it. But just like, George Lucas created this incredible universe called Star Wars, and then he invited people to come in and create there, right? And say, use these characters, use this world, make it bigger, tell better stories. And so what happens is Tom Colgan gets to pick the writers that come in and write for the Clancy estate. And so he was, and still is, my editor for my Matt Drake series. And when I turned in my second book, which was called The Outside Man, when you turn in a book, your editor comes back with notes, and you have what's called the editorial call. And it's kind of like being in 4th grade and forgetting your homework, and you got to stand in front of the teacher. And so you just want to make sure you have the answers. And so we got to the end of the call, and I'm like, okay, I had all the answers. And he very much did this Columbo-esque thing where he's like, "I've got one more question for you. Would you be interested in writing in the Clancy world?" And I'm like, what did he just say? I think he said Tom Clancy. And so that was...
I definitely need clarification if someone said that to me.
Yes. And my jaw kind of hit the floor. And at first, honestly, I was going to say no, because I still had a full-time job at the time. And with writing, especially as fiction writing, the work is there usually before the money is. And so, when you're a young writer starting out, your advances aren't usually enough to live on. And I was like, there's no way I can keep my full-time job and write, because what I would have had to do was write a book every 5 months, basically, write one of my books, write one of the Clancy books. And so I told my wife, and I was like, I was really flattered. This is what they offered, but I'm going to tell them no. And she's like, "You're going to what?" And I'm like, "I can't do this." And then she's like, "Family meeting." And so the kids come in and everything. And so we ended up making a plan. We're like, "Hey, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and do both." My boss, Brandon, was amazing. And at one point, I'm like, "Look, man, take 25% or 20% of my pay back. I got to have Fridays off. Let me try and do this." And he's like, "Okay, we'll make it work for 2 months, see if you can do it." And at the end of it, I was able to transition and go write the Clancy books. And then that led to next year, I'm going to take over the Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp series. And so was super excited about that too. And it's it's a humbling and kind of a terrifying experience at the same time. I have a friend who's a writer named Josh Hood that writes in the Jason Bourne universe, and he said, it's kind of like you get handed the keys to your dad's, classic Stingray convertible, and he says, take it for a spin, and you want to drive that thing as fast as it'll go, but bring it home without any new dings in it. And so, you're very much aware that you're standing on the shoulders of giants, both the original writers and the ones that came, before you. But at the same time, you're like, the first time I sat down at my computer and typed Jack Ryan, and I'm like, I can't believe I get to write this guy. Like, this is the character that made me want to be a writer, and now I get to write him, and hopefully I won't be the guy that burns him into the ground. Hopefully I can tell a good story with it. And so, yeah, it's been, I think anything in life, right, is part showing up every day and being really willing to work hard, and part of it's being lucky and being in the right place at the right time.
No kidding. That's super lucky. So tell me about the new book. I mean, how did you come about it? How does it dovetail into all this? I mean, it seems like your history has a lot to do with these stories.
Yeah, so my fourth book is called, in the Matt Drake series, is called Forgotten War, and I'll tell you just a little bit about Matt for background. So I wrote 3 books that didn't sell, and before the first book in the Matt Drake series is called Without Sanction did. And so when I was talking to my editor, he said, if you're a new writer writing fiction, what you have to do is do something that's the same but different. And so you have to fit into the genre you're in, but you can't copy what everybody else has done. And so when I sat down to write Without Sanction, I knew I wanted to base it around this character, but I made a couple choices that were different than the rest of the genre. So the first, I'm a huge Nelson DeMille fan, and he was kind enough to blurb Forgotten War for me. And one of his books, or one of his series, is the John Corey series, and he writes about this New York detective. And he writes in a first-person voice, which is just writer talk for saying that the character uses I. The character tells you the story. And I read his first book in that series called Plum Island, and I told my wife after I got done reading it, like, I would go read about John Corey going to the gas station because he's so funny and it's so engaging. And when I looked at this genre, there aren't a lot of writers who write that style. So I said, all right, I'm going to have this guy called Matt Drake. I'm going to write him as a witty first-person protagonist voice. The second thing is I looked out and saw there were a lot of CIA guys running around, a lot of special forces folks, but I got to be familiar with an organization called the DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency. So it has very same mission as the CIA, but it reports through the military chain of command. And so there's all kinds of great conflict there because the CIA and DIA squabble over assets and, have turf wars. And so I said, all right, I'm going to take this guy, Matt, and make him a case officer in the DIA because, number one, that isn't something people have done. And number two, it's very similar to the job I did as an FBI agent, where my job was to recruit sources, Matt's job was to recruit assets. And the final thing I decided to do was to make him a former Army Ranger because so many of my friends were former Army Rangers, and it isn't something I saw in fiction a lot. And so Matt is a case officer for the DIA. He has a best friend who's named Frodo, who goes by his radio call sign Frodo, who was a former sniper in Delta Force. And so one of my close friends came from that organization as well. And in fact, his first assignment after making it through the operator training course and everything was Somalia, was Black Hawk Down. And he served for, I think, 15 or 16 years in Delta Force. He's still my go-to person when I have questions and stuff. And so Frodo takes a lot from him. And so my first book, you see them together, and now 4 books later, I've gotten a lot of emails and Facebook posts and social media from folks that say, we really want to see how Matt and Frodo came together originally. Because when Without Sanction starts, and that's the other thing I did, is I finally got brave enough to put some of the things that I wrestled with in my book. And so when Without Sanction begins, Matt has just come back from a tour in Syria, and he lost an asset and his asset's family, and Frodo was horribly injured by an IED, and Matt thinks the entire thing is his fault, which is, shoes that I had been in before. And so when the books start, Frodo has already he's lost his arm and part of his leg, and he can't work in his old job anymore. He still works with the DIA, but he isn't Matt's bodyguard. And so I thought, it would be really fun to write kind of an origin story to show the two of them working together. But where am I going to set that? And so I was thinking about that in the summer of 2021 as Afghanistan was crumbling, as we were withdrawing from Afghanistan. And, as I was watching it happen, I was getting all these...
surreal.
It was awful. Like I said before, we were, I think, I don't want to say most veterans because I don't want to speak for veterans, but most of the veterans I talked to were fine with us leaving Afghanistan. We certainly didn't want our sons and daughters to go there a generation later, but it couldn't end like that because then if it crumbles, what does that mean for the brothers and sisters that we lost there? What does it mean for the years of our life? Less than 1/4% of American citizens have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. But that 1/4%, most of them, I'm the exception to the rule, most of them have served multiple times in Afghanistan or Iraq. My best friend, Kelsey Smith, he and I were troop commanders together in Afghanistan. It was his helicopters I was flying. He deployed, I think, a total of 6 times, each of them a year-long deployment. And so you've given up so much of your life for what? And not just that, but Afghanistan is kind of like the foundation for everything war on terror related, right? And so if you knock that stone out, then does Iraq come crumbling down? Does all the sacrifices everybody made in all of those different places for the last 20 years, was any of that worth it? And so you had that. On one hand, you're thinking, was it worth it? On the other hand, I was half joking and half not, texting my old first sergeant who works for an organization that provided helicopters and munitions to the Afghan army, and I'm like, are there still helicopters there? And he's like, I can tell you what hangar the rockets are. And so you're kind of half joking, well, maybe I checked flights to Kabul, maybe we could help out, right? Joking. And then you see people like the Pineapple Express that pony up and go and do it. And you think in a nation's history, not since Dunkirk probably have civilians stepped up and said, not on our watch. We're not going to leave those people behind, because by God, we told them if they stood shoulder to shoulder with us, that America would take care of it. And so if our government isn't going to do it, we're going to do it. And so I'm watching all of this happen. And a good friend of mine's a writer named Nick Petrie. He writes a series called The Drifter. And he told me once that in a great book, what the writer's trying to do is answer a question for themselves in the pages. And so I'm looking at this and I'm like, what would Matt do? What would Matt and Frodo do? How would this play out? And so while Forgotten War, which comes out on Tuesday, is the name of the book, it is certainly fiction. Many of the things that happen in there really happened. And if it didn't, they're based on operations that happened. But the conversations between the characters that form the emotional backbone very much reflect the conversations I had with fellow Afghan veterans as everybody's trying to process it. And so the way that the book starts is that Matt and Frodo are in a bar, and 2 Army CID officers arrest Frodo for a war crime, and for a war crime that took place 10 years ago when he and Matt were first in Afghanistan together. And so what Matt can't figure out is that Frodo wants to plead guilty to it, and he won't talk about it. He just says, I'm guilty, I'm guilty. And Matt's like, I was there with you. You didn't murder anybody. And he says, I'm guilty. And so Matt starts trying to find the other ODA, the other Special Forces guys who were in the building with them that night, and they're all dying one by one under mysterious circumstances. And so he figures the only way he can clear Frodo's name is to go to Afghanistan and find the interpreter, who's the last surviving person that was with that team, and get that guy to testify as what happened. But he's trying to go into Afghanistan as everybody else is going out. And so you see the backdrop of Afghanistan. You see 10 years earlier what actually went down in that building and what happened with Frodo. And it was very much, I think, you have to be careful as a writer, especially a writer of fiction, because your first job is to tell a damn good story. Your first job is to get readers to turn the page. And I think books that start out with a premise that I'm going to preach to you about X, Y, or Z subject, readers don't want that. They want a great story. But I think also readers resonate with veracity. Like they can see in the pages, even though it's fiction, there's something there that's real. And that's what I've been getting a lot in the reviews so far for Forgotten War is like, I'm not used to seeing this sort of emotional impact in a book in this genre. Like, it's a great story. It kept me turning the pages, but I finally understand, I think now, what veterans of Afghanistan went through and what they saw as Afghanistan was crumbling. And so, again, it's meant to be a great story. It's meant to turn pages. It's not meant to preach at anybody. But I think if you're to write a great book, or maybe hopefully even a good book, you got to be willing to pour the stuff that scares you into those pages. And that was certainly what was scaring me at the time.
Mm-hmm. Do you write in any of the civilian stuff you did? Are the FBI involved in any of these cases, or local PD or anything like that?
Yeah, I don't write. I don't really write about the FBI, but the intelligence community certainly plays a big role in it. And again, it's not stuff that I learned in the FBI. I think it's more the folks. Like I said, I've just been lucky enough to rub shoulders with some really interesting people. And most of them, when you buy them a beer, tell you the most incredible stories. And there are some that you're like, I'm going to use pieces of that. And I always ask them if I can. There are some, the stories are so great where you're like, I'd love to use that, but nobody'd believe it. I had a customer who was a Green Beret, and we were having a beer. He was a captain, and he had been an enlisted Green Beret, went to West Point, met his wife there at West Point. She was a fellow cadet. They get married. She goes and actually flies Apaches. He goes back to the infantry, goes back to becoming a Green Beret. The marriage doesn't work out. They divorce. He is in Iraq with his guys. They're ambushed, and he calls for gunship support. It's his ex-wife that's overhead shooting rockets. I'm like, that is so good, but nobody would believe it. And so I think, you have to tell a good story first and foremost.
Wait, ex-wife?
Yeah.
Oof.
And I was like, was it a good divorce? And he's like, no. So yeah.
Oh yeah, they wouldn't believe that ending.
No,
they made it out alive.
Not. They did. He's like, I'm still here.
That's really funny. So corruption, is that something that kind of meant something to you as you were like, you wanted to tackle a corruption issue, or is this really more about corruption just played a part as it related to what you were trying to talk about?
You mean as far as the book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't look as much. Certainly Afghanistan is a study in corruption. There's no two ways about it. And I think one of the things that make Americans exceptional is we tend to look at the rest of the world and we look at them through our eyes and say, surely if these values are important to us, they're going to be important to you no matter what country you're in, and you'll fight for them. And unfortunately, that hasn't proven to be true. And on the flip side, I think that is why the people in Ukraine right now resonate so much with the Western world, because you see, down to men and women who were teachers and nurses and stuff willing to fight for their country. In Afghanistan, you just didn't see that by and large. There were certainly Afghans that were courageous. There were commando units that did it, but as a populace, there wasn't the same dedication to that. And during the original invasion, when the famous horse soldiers were going in, there were CIA officers who were walking in with bags of cash, and the Afghan sentiment is that you can't buy loyalty, but you can rent it. And so that is, and we tried as, not we, but America tried to root that out. They tried, and it's just so ingrained in the culture and so ingrained in how they did business. And so I didn't make it a point in Forgotten War to talk as much about the corruption as just to say, here is, you can either see the battlefield as how you want it to be or accept it how it is. And what I think maybe would have done us as a nation from a strategic standpoint better to say, this is how it is. And here is what our national objective is. And we're willing to do this, but we're not going to be able to convert this into a democracy or into a Western style democracy or something. And so what I spent more of the book's focus on was just what astounded me was going back to the Pineapple Express and stuff, was this willingness for civilians to go in and do what the military wasn't allowed to do, and so that's what you see is Matt and this band of veterans that he puts together doing their own version of the Pineapple Express to go get this interpreter. I didn't make a a big play on corruption because it is what it is.
I was supposed to grab coffee with Tim Kennedy, and he ditched me to go to Afghanistan, so I will forever hold that against him. And then another friend of mine, former CISO of the Pentagon, apparently he was involved, but from the logistics perspective, because it turns out it's very difficult to know who's who on the ground.
Yep.
And so, they might have the right name, but they're not the same person, or they might say that they're that person, they're not that person, and comms are unencrypted, and so just figuring out who's who and where was an enormous challenge, and they had to do it, practically overnight. Yeah. So I got to see it from the other side, I guess, from sitting back in the lawn chair and just watching it all go down for my friends, but it's pretty rough.
No, and that's when you talk about figuring out who's who, that comes up in Forgotten War, because one of the things that the U.S. military did, or the U.S. in general, there are a couple agencies that did it, was implemented this huge biometric program where a lot of Afghans only have one name, right? And so they got the biometric identifiers on all these people and then allowed that to fall into the hands of the Taliban. And so you literally have Taliban that are going doing iris scans and saying, that guy worked for the Americans, shoot him in the head. And it's just... it was tragic, and that was when I read it, I'm like, this can't be true, and then you see how it's happening, and so that became part of Forgotten War too, and is one of the things that's driving the story is this database. I made the problem worse, as novelists do for books, but instead of having, most of what you saw were kind of the handheld devices that would do biometric scans, and so you had the data on that hard drive for however many people it connected to, but you didn't have the entire database of everyone, maybe, necessarily. And so I did that for Forgotten War. I'm like, what would happen if they left the entire database, and who would want that? Because even those little biometric scanners, like the Russians, the Iranians, Chinese, everybody was trying to get their hands on that because it's the, number one, the technology, but number two, you could identify every single asset, every person who helped the Americans. I mean, it takes, a while ago, the Chinese hacked the OPM records, that when you fill out your security clearance, you tell everything that somebody could use to corrupt you, and the Chinese stole all of that and so everybody that has a security clearance, they know your background, they know they would have the ability to come up with a pitch that would target just you. Well, this is taking it a step further, where they could identify you by your saliva, by your iris scan, by your blood type. So that made it into Forgotten War too.
A funny story about that. We know that it was the Chinese who did the OPM hack, not just theorize, because what happened is somewhere along the line, we hacked into China and we found the OPM data sitting there, and we actually sent emissaries over to try to show them how to protect it so that other countries wouldn't get the data.
I never heard that. That's crazy.
Isn't that right? That's crazy. Some of my friends are sort of half involved in that. But... well, that kind of begs another question. So the FBI has crazy detailed records on people. Yeah. OPM is another good example in this. What do you think about data collection? Is that something you think we should be doing more of, or stop doing, or what?
Yeah, that's a really hard subject, because even if you take the FBI side, right? There was in the news last week that there was a new hack for the iPhone that they'd allow. That you could get in and get all your passwords, get everything from that. The reason why a bunch of I can't remember if Texas has done it yet or not, is banning TikTok, is because TikTok then takes everything that's on your iPhone, all the data there, all your browsing history, all your passwords. And so we are, with just our cell phones, think about what you think is secure there from your credit cards, your bank statements, your passwords and everything, and now that's vulnerable, and we've put it in there, and voluntarily. I think from a government perspective, we have to be super, super careful about what data we collect, because I think there was a time where we, as an American people, viewed the government as good at their job, as not infallible, but we won the Cold War, right? Like, we came on, if the government says they're going to protect my data, they're going to protect my data. What we're seeing now is the opposite of that, right? That we can't assume, the default position can't be assumed, can't be that we assume that the government is going to protect the data that it's collected, that they're going to be good at their job. I think especially when it comes to data, we have to start from the opposite perspective. Let's assume that this will be at some point inadvertently, via the OPM or on purpose by somebody like the airman that just leaked all the classified documents everywhere, right, gets forfeited. And so what do we feel comfortable collecting on the American people, knowing that it might be put at risk, it might be put out there? And I think we should, instead of coming with the attitude of we're the government, you can trust us, we'll protect it, we should start from the other thing and say the burden of proof is on you, the government, to be able to display, yes, you can protect this information before you ask people from it. Because it is, you're right. I mean, the data breaches and stuff that we get now are crazy, and you're putting individual Americans potentially at risk because of that.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of begs the question, like, let's say you're on the other side of the fence and you want to defect or want to help or whatever. Are you sure you trust the U.S. government with that
Absolutely.
data? Or any government, not just the United States, so we're not the only ones who are vulnerable, but why would you entrust some agent with this data?
And that's always been true from an espionage perspective, right? When I was in the FBI Academy, they would beat into our heads the two, Aldrich Ames, who was from the CIA, that was a huge spy for a number of years, and then Robert Hansen, his counterpart in the FBI.
It's different spelling, though.
Wait a minute, I knew your name sounded familiar. And what was awful during that period of time is the CIA and the FBI were fighting because they were each convinced that the other had the leak, and they both had the leak, right? And so people died because of those two men. Like, assets were rolled up overseas and killed because of those two men. We recently had, a couple of years ago, where we were talking, it became news that many of our assets in China were rolled up and killed, right? Because of some security breach somewhere. And so now that was maybe part of the accepted cost of doing business if you were in espionage, if you were a spy or something. But now I wonder that, right? You see leaks just across the government where people their tax information gets leaked, their personal information gets leaked. And so, yeah, it makes you think, what is safe and what should I have to provide to the government, knowing that the government is apparently not a safe data repository, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, kind of the opposite direction. The Chinese have taken a different tack, which is we're just going to put everybody's social credit score online. You'll be able to see who we're after and who we think is a spy or whatever. Just like right there, look at their social credit. There it is. And then you don't have to have jackbooted, guys come into the door beating stuff down, because your entire cohort of people around you aren't going to have anything to do with you anymore because they're worried about their credit score going down.
Yeah.
So it kind of reminds me a little of this one experiment this guy did this decades ago now, but he basically had a camera attached to him, which at that time sounded very strange. Now people do it all the time. But at that time, he took photos of everywhere he went all day long and posted them to this website. Said exactly where he was going to go, who he was going to meet, basically a diary, but it was all public, like in crazy detail. Like, here's what I talked about, here's who I'm meeting with. And because his fear, I think he was a journalist, but I think he was also had some information, a whistleblower of some kind. Mm-hmm. His theory was, if I'm going to get abducted, you're going to at least know who did it. You're going to at least get one photo of them, kind of thing. And I mean, there's a lot of sense to that. But also, I mean, we're already being monitored by 100 different technologies around us at all times. Not you and I, of course, our phones are off for this, except for these 3 cameras here. But I mean, I don't know where I land on that. I guess I'm totally against all forms of monitoring, but at the same time, I totally understand why, a government would want it. And a guy like me, I develop a lot of technologies for companies, and I've developed a lot of decloaking technologies, ways to find out who people really are behind the keyboard. And so I am in many ways the reason a lot of these things are problematic, but I am also trying to stop those things at the same time. So I've kind of landed on both sides of this issue in different parts of my career. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard. I think fundamentally one of the things that makes the United States different, or one of our founding ideals, is this notion of that what you own is yours, that you are allowed to have personal property, that's the foundation of individual rights, that I can buy something and it's mine and the government can't come and take it from me, right? It belongs to me. And I think our personal data and the information kind of falls into that sphere too, right? Like that's yours, that belongs to you. The government shouldn't be able to just come and take that from you. But it has certainly gotten a whole lot more complicated, where you were talking about with phones, where we surrender a lot of that stuff, right? We voluntarily say, hey, for the convenience of carrying it all in my iPhone or getting a cookie to this website or whatever, I'm willing to give up my position, my personal data, and so where does that line lie, right? Is it still yours if you give it up? Is it, does somebody have to ask you for it? And I think, I don't know, it is certainly an evolving debate for sure.
Mm-hmm. So what is next for your series? Are you going to do another book, books plural, or what's your plan?
So this year's pretty crazy for me. So I have 3 books that are coming out. I've got Forgotten War that comes out on the 25th of April, and then I have Flashpoint, which is my 3rd Clancy novel, that comes out on the 23rd of May, and then I am frantically finishing the edits and stuff for Weapons Grade, which comes out in September. So after that, I'm going to transition to my first Mitch Rapp book, and I don't know what I'm going to work on after that. I'm lucky enough, I have a fantastic editor who does my Clancy books and my Matt Drake books, and what I basically told him is I'll check in with you in December. And so it could be another Matt Drake book, it could be another Clancy book, it could be a standalone, but that's a good problem to have.
Are these going to get converted into TV shows or movies, do you think?
That is like the dream of all writers. And so it looks easier now, or more promising, because you have people like Jack Carr's a friend of mine, and his series on Amazon, The Terminal List, came out. Mark Graney's a friend of mine. His series, The Gray Man, came out. But Brad Taylor's a friend of mine, and he's been writing for 12 or 13 years and have never had anything. Brad Thor hasn't, Vince Flynn. And so it's somebody who is more experienced or farther down this path than I was, said, you know what, don't plan your mortgage payments on the TV stuff coming. If it happens, great, but just keep writing and hope for the best. And that's where I'm at right now.
I work in this business. I don't plan on that either.
It's funny because you see so many writers get their hearts broken, because I know Hollywood a tiny, tiny bit. One of my friends is Chris Hottie, and he made his living as a screenplay writer before he came and writed books. And he's had a couple like Sniper and stuff like that made, but the majority of him, which I think is common with screenplays anyway, get optioned and then never made into movies. But writers, we don't know that. And so you see your friend, they're like, oh my gosh, my book got optioned, it's going to get made. And they're like, It's just like, that's great. I would love to have mine get optioned. But my friend, Taylor Moore, he's a former CIA officer. He writes a great series. His first book is called Downrange. When it got optioned, his film agent called him in and said, listen, you have a better chance of going to space than this becoming a movie. So take the money, be happy, but don't count on this making the mortgage payments.
Yeah. You can have a cup, you can get there, change.
Exactly.
And shaking it.
Exactly.
Alms for the poor writer. Well, that's great. Well, how do people get in touch with you? How do they find the book and all that stuff?
Yeah, so Forgotten War comes out next Tuesday, April 25th, and you can find it anywhere they sell books. But the easiest way to keep track of me is my website is donbentley.books.com, and it's Bentley. And so if you go there, you can sign up for my newsletter. I talk about everything I'm working on. If I know it, my newsletter subscribers find out first. If you're a social media kind of person, I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and all of them are just at Bentley Don B. So I always love to hear from readers. If you send me an email, I promise I'll write you back. So even if you're mean.
Wow, that's a big
promise.
And
I get some mean ones. It's funny. I think most people.
I might write you a mean one just to see what
happens. Do
it.
Because when I write them back, I figure if you've taken the time to write me an email, I'll write you back. And they're like, I thought I'd hear from your people, not you. I'm like, listen, I do not have people, my friend. It is me and me only. That's it.
I love it. Well, Don, this has been a pleasure, man.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.